So on behalf of the Center for Media Engagement and the Media and Democracy Data Co-op, I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Digital Data Conference sponsored by the Social Science Research Council. My name is Jo Lukito. I am the chair of the Digital Data Conference, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. So we'll begin with a keynote speech by Dr. David Lazer. Dr. Lazer is a University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Computer Science at Northeastern University. And he is also the co-director of the NU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks. And we're thrilled, absolutely thrilled to have him today to present our Thursday keynote, The State of Digital Data Research. Take it away.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who's online, who's spending an hour with us. Let me just pull up the slides and to the slideshow. All right. First thing, so I've titled the talk after a paper of mine and others, Meaningful Measures of Human Society in the 21st Century. It's substantially drawing from this paper, although it's not 100%. I do want to acknowledge my, this is a snapshot of the paper, which appeared in Nature last year. And I also want to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper. So this very much required a lot of discussing, talking, writing, rewriting. I see Dean is on the next panel, so so I'd appreciate it if you would hold any of your hard questions for him. So so let me sorry, advancing. There we go. So I think there are sort of ideal types when we're talking about sort of digital data, and of course, ultimately all data, almost all data are digital. But like there's really, there's sort of an implication there of these novel kinds of data collection, and often of which check a number of boxes, and we can think of an ideal type of thinking about recycled data that's collected for other purposes, sometimes called digital exhaust, or way back when we called it in digital breadcrumbs. That they often have dynamic elements, so the possibility of much higher frequency of sampling than would be typical in social science, most social science research, and at a much larger scale. Rather than hundreds or thousands of units of analysis, of millions or billions, and with often fine granularity, both temporally, like literally this is the point in time this happened, or spatially. So there are all of these sort of, it's not necessarily all of these, but these are sort of some of the characteristics of thinking about these emergent forms of data collection, which offer, I think, enormous scientific possibilities, but they also present some measurement challenges. And I want to sort of discuss that and think about that and hopefully provoke some discussion about that. Certainly that was our objective in the paper. I think the upside here is quite considerable, that the question is, what are the novel things that matter that we can see now? For example, surely we should be able to see dynamics way more than was possible. Was research on residential segregation, but now we can actually see people moving through neighborhoods and thinking about not just where people live, which matters, but that was represented in older research, but mobility, so we can see how people intersect. We can look at how people are interconnected. So obviously there has been research on social networks going back for a long time, but there's this possibility of looking at connectivity at a just vastly larger scale than was even conceivable a generation ago, and even just thinking about how people react or what they are, or something like personality, which we often think of as sort of a static construct, as being a highly contingent construct, that there are ways that we might fundamentally change how we view things. But Twitter is not a telescope. I'm guessing the modal form of research is on Twitter data, and people are not stars. Most of these data were not designed by or for science. And of course, the challenge is that the rules that govern humanity vary by time and place, and our understanding of those rules may change the rules. So there's sort of this circularity of sorts, that understanding of human systems changes them in a way that if you look at the stars, you do not change the placement of the stars. And so so it's funny because I'm building on, I'll note later, I'm going to discuss an effort of ours centered at Northeastern around creating an observatory for what happens on the internet. But there's a useful analog there, but it also breaks down in important ways. So, for example, we can think about the use of mobility data to study the spread of COVID-19 and to build predictive models saying, well, here's where the populations are mixing. This is built in part on a pretty sound theoretical understanding of the spread of disease, which is that COVID-19 spreads human to human, and the movements of humans will move disease. And so thus having data on large-scale population movements can inform prediction and predictive models of the spread of COVID. And so like here, and this is a project from, you can look at data from a colleague of mine, Alex Vespignani, who's done a lot of this amazing predictive work, looking at the contact patterns, that is when people are proximate, this is from the data from the US, and you can see from looking at baseline in February 2020, if people can remember that far back, that there was a quite dramatic drop in the US mid-March. And through a year later, there had been some bounce back, but it was still quite far from baseline. What's interesting here, of course, is that this is useful for modeling, but also people change their behavior. So these predictive models, in a way, struggle because by making predictions, you actually then change people's behavior. So if you say, well, COVID is spiking and it's going to be quite high, but if you stay home, you won't get sick. That's based on both an empirical understanding, the spread of a disease, as well as a sort of theoretical understanding that informs individual behavior as well as public policy. And so this is, I think, a nice example of both how this digital exhaust data, which is a sort of mobility data collected for other purposes, could be used for scientific purposes, but also to the human reactivity to understanding of social systems and how that actually presents an interesting kind of scientific challenge in itself. And I'll note that this has some similarity and some difference to Snow's ancient map of looking at where outbreaks of cholera, where there were outbreaks of cholera in London, and what wells people used. That in this case, this was designed data collection to test the hypothesis that the wells were the source of cholera, but in other ways, it also then had subsequent and important impacts on human behavior and public policy. And so what's interesting here is that our understanding begets changes in human behavior, but also that this was purposeful data collection. But it also had limitations in terms of scale. Yet was still quite powerful. So one of the things, again, focusing on this notion of instability of rules around human society, means that we need to be constantly refreshing our measures of human society. And I think there are a couple elements to this. One is any measure needs to be refreshed, and like this is whether we're talking about some of the older forms of data versus newer forms, and I'll give you some examples in a few minutes of this. But also, I think the key thing as we think about the new measures is to think about what new insights they can provide. Number one. Number two, that we need to we need to be careful not to only evaluate the new measures against the old measures, because otherwise we're just going to end up fitting our new measures to the shortcomings of the old measures. And so, for example, I'm just going to give a shout out to a student, a former student of mine, Carolina Matson, who's done all this work on mobile money. And what's striking here is, there's this notion in the study in monetary economics around money velocity, which is roughly speaking how many times a dollar is used per unit of time, right? And that's normally, let's say, calculated as an average within the country. And what Dr. Matson did is she defended literally mid-March 2020, which was an interesting time to defend a dissertation, and is now at the University of Leiden, is that we can now look at how specific dollars were transacted between two people at a particular moment in time. And what we see, for example, is that, and this is sort of hinted at in the figure on the right, which is she could look at some mobile money systems, and she could look at the amounts and who and aggregate it. And so, unsurprisingly, as we know with many things, is that really a few people do have large sums which turn over very quickly, and then a lot of people have money that just sort of sits there for a while. And so this has to matter. Like when we start to look at things, this has to completely change our paradigm in terms of the notion of money in economics. I think that paradigm change still has to happen, but I think it will happen, and I think this is just sort of symptomatic of the intellectual opportunities that we should be looking at important things in completely new ways, and being able to look at a dollar here. We can look at dollars in completely different ways than we could even a few years ago, because there are these systems that really capture what happens with every dollar. And that has to matter. It has to matter for policy. It has to matter for practice. It has to matter for theory. So I think that that's watch this corner, watch Dr. Matson's work. So in any case, here I want to focus on a series of key questions that should inform our thinking about measurements and scientific possibilities. One is what counts. The second is what are the temporal, spatial, and structural and cultural integrity of a measure? Who is counted? What is accessible to counting, and what is ethical to count? So what counts? So the goal of measurement is to extract meaning from raw data extracted from instrumentation. So the instrumentation, of course, if we're thinking about measurement generically, it could be a survey question, and we know we have to be careful about how we interpret answers to survey questions. But I think that at least survey questions are typically designed with a scientific question in mind, and the challenge it's always a challenge to extract meaningful measures, but it becomes more so when, arguably, on average, as a generalization, that when you start out with raw data for something that was collected for completely other purposes, what happens when in the repurposing process. So, for example, for the mobility data and the spread of COVID-19, there's the question of what kinds of mobility and what kinds of proximity would be associated with spreading. And we of course understand that now better, at least, but like a proximity, two people outdoors, turns out is going to have a vastly less impact on the likelihood of the disease spreading between them than two people indoors. And two people indoors in a poorly ventilated space will have a much bigger impact than two people in a big open space. And those mobility data, of course, can't capture that. Now, it may be okay as people in the beginning, as people have no idea about anything. You're like, well, there's signal there when proximity goes up. That means indoor proximity goes up. It means that that indoor poorly ventilated proximity goes up, and we can use these as a sort of indicator of sorts. But once we start to understand the disease, then people start to say, well, let's get together in a park. Let's go for a walk together rather than go have lunch. All right, we're going to have a meeting in an office, but let's wear masks. And so the same measurement of like, all right, we're observing two dots that are within a certain distance of each other, probably meant something very different in early March 2020 than it did a year later. And now, as I look at how people are interacting, I think it means something different still. That is, we see a lot more people who are proximate, but like the transmission probabilities again change because people are vaccinated. So all this is the notion of pulling back the layers of like, what do we really care about based on the theory that on the theory that the measurement is meant to serve. And so looking at the question of, again, what counts, when we think about online behaviors, there's the question of platform-specific behaviors. There are multiple issues of generalization. For example, is what we see on Twitter generalized to Facebook, right? Which is in some ways a very different platform, but in many ways, in certain kinds of ways, it's based on sort of network connections and so on. It has some similarities. So when are we making scientific statements about this platform versus something that we think generalizes? And I think this is something the field needs to work on. And then to what extent are we dealing with a set of findings that is about this platform today that may not even generalize to this platform tomorrow? So how much of research, for example, on Twitter really generalizes beyond literally the dates in which those data were collected? And I think we would, again, this is in part about the broader sort of theoretical and research endeavor, but it also may have put additional burdens on the scholarly community to think about what scientific assertions are necessary, what kinds of replications are necessary if you were really to feel comfortable with the scientific generalizations. Friendship is a nice one because sometimes the term friend when we look at some of the literature has vastly heterogeneous meaning. So sometimes people say, well, a connection. We're going to call two people calling each other, or two people who follow each other on Twitter, or people who even are friends on Facebook as friends. But those are very different things, and B, they're also like sociological notions of friendship, which have to do with like how do you behave with friends? What do you owe friends? Where the trusts, reciprocity, affection, all of those go back to really thinking about what are the dimensions of friendship, and none of that's extremely different in turn from those digital traces. And so the notion of like thinking of friendship as a social scientific construct and exactly what we mean and how that translates across platforms is something that has sometimes not been well treated in the literature, and I think needs that sort of extra kinds of conceptualization. We have a problem in many platforms that the entities we look at are heterogeneous, and of course, Twitter is a great example because I'm on Twitter, but then again, so is General Motors, and so is CBS News, and so is Elon Musk, and all of those are rather different kinds of entities, and so how do we deal with the heterogeneity of those units, and the fact that actually many of those units may even what they appear because of the vulnerability of platforms for manipulation, and the way platforms deal with manipulation, like setting up sock puppets or what have you, is not going to be according to scientific priorities, it'll be to their commercial priorities, and which is perhaps their prerogative, but it does create a challenge for scientists who are using these platforms for research. And then finally, of course, is algorithmic confounding. And unfortunately, the algorithms change all the time. And so, Twitter was not so very many years ago looking, your news feeds were just most recent posts were seen, and now it tends to be algorithmically curated, but you sort of can choose. But Twitter constantly tries to push you back to the algorithmic curation. And so when we see certain kinds of people, let's say people retweet certain kinds of content, is that because they like it, or is that because the platform keeps on showing it to them? And we can't. There are ways that we could disentangle that, but it's typically not done. I'm going to return to that, the issue of ways to disentangle in just a few minutes. What is the temporal, spatial, structural, and cultural integrity of the measure? And here I'll actually give you an example of a survey question. And again, I think some of these issues around instability, and this is an idea I should note that Kevin Munger has written especially eloquently about, this is a question from the American National Election Survey. Would you say you listen? This is how they measured sort of media consumption, civic and news media consumption, and from 1978. Would you say you listen to a good many, several, or just one or two speeches or discussions on the radio about the campaign, right? To capture, I guess, this is from 1978, so I guess the 1978 election, and like, that really wouldn't be a great question today for capturing media consumption. And so there is a problem, ironically, that there are a lot of things that are just frankly not comparable across years. And the challenge, of course, with platform data is a lot of the stuff on the internet changes so quickly that here we're talking about a survey question from 40 or 50 years ago. But I think that for many things on platforms, 4 or 5 years ago is around equivalent to 40 or 50 years when it comes to a lot of changes or evolution in survey constructs. I'll give you some examples from my own research of things that deal with, potentially have issues in terms of how generalizable they are across time. This is a paper with Toole and others from 2015, looking at predicting employment shocks from mobility phone data, as well as actually individual level unemployment. And we showed that you could look at people's mobility and changes in mobility, and you could predict actually with much better than above baseline models of future employment rate, unemployment rates, because it turns out when you lose your job, your movement behaviors change. Well, I think those relationships have been substantially changed in the last couple of years. And so do I really think that the kinds of empirical patterns we found here would apply to a pandemic world? And, certainly not. Is there still something going on there where, let's say, if we entered a recession, we might see changes in mobility? And the answer is probably yes, but the nature of that relationship would change. A lot of this is like, well, if you wanted to use some of these as proxies for employment, that would be an issue. Another example is a paper I had Nathan Eagle and Sandy Pentland in 2009, looking at behavioral correlates of friendship. And there are both generalizability issues here because we're looking at sort of students and faculty at MIT, which is already a particular sample. And of course, one always has to worry about generalizability. But here we were looking at things like proximity again. And it turned out that friends, unsurprisingly, tended to be closer to each other, and reciprocal friends especially turned out to be closer to each other off of campus. And so there's an interesting question of how robust these patterns would be to again, the pandemic patterns, and surely these relationships would have changed quite radically in the last 13 years, actually 16, because I think we collected these data in 2006, where we instrumented everyone's phones to capture their proximities. But even things like how we measured proximity is going to differ with instrumentation, because the way you would do this now would be quite different than the way we did it with cell phone technology 2006. So there's the issue of the world has changed because of the pandemic, and then there's also this subtle ways the technology has changed that would potentially be consequential. So again, I think these are fine papers, by the way. I'm not saying you should never read these papers, but I'm saying that there is a core issue around generalizability and what's embedded in the instrumentation that really requires one to do a study like this again, and obviously a study like this in different places and so on. And so, this is in part gets to issues around replication and so on, and constantly adjusting and rethinking measurement in a way that is probably atypical to the way it has typically been done in the usually done in the social sciences until now. So who is measured? This gets at the question of who is in what platform, what behaviors manifest by those individuals in the platforms, and also the need for measurements that cross platforms and non-platforms. This has been an issue forever, of course, in the social sciences, which is that if let's say you have random digit dial surveys, well, guess what? You're only getting people who had landlines, and some people did not have landlines. Even let's say in the 1990s, there were a few percentage of the population that did not have landlines, and for certain scientific purposes, that leaving them out would be extremely consequential. Some people had 2 landlines and would potentially be overcounted. That was, phones were a platform for data collection, and it presented certain kinds of biases. Who hangs up the phone when they get a survey, and so on. And so it's just not a question of who is on the platform, but who is willing to engage with the research data collection. What behaviors are manifest by those individuals on the platform? So, for example, on Facebook, who talks about politics? From my experience, my very idiosyncratic experience, actually most people on Facebook aren't talking about politics anymore, because it's sort of emerged as a sort of silent norm. But there are a few people who are willing to put lots of political stuff in there, whereas Twitter is something that seems to have more political engagement. But like, that's a sort of qualitative kind of non-citable, non-rigorous impression. But like, the willingness to express opinions and who is willing to express those opinions is something that we observe what is observable. We don't observe the people who are not in the platform. We don't observe the silent people in the platforms. And so that choice for expression, for example, if we're studying who is saying what, will be very consequential. And this is also points to the need for measurements that cross platforms. In part, this is because if we want to be in the scientific endeavor, we need to do something more than, let's say, Twitternomics, right? Like, we need to think about what are our general scientific principles, how different platforms elicit similar behaviors or different behaviors, and then, of course, looking at how this reflects what doesn't happen on platforms at all. Like, are the people who talk about politics on Twitter the same ones who talk about it on Facebook, the same ones who talk about it in person? And so thinking about a sort of people's multimedia existences and getting an understanding of their differential differences is something that I think we've seen better qualitative, we've seen some very good qualitative research on, which I think is important, but also we need more quantitative research that is multi-platform. I think that the question, much of the tools of 20th century social science, in part because, think about who is measured, in part has focused on the middle of the distributions, right? We think, oh, it's sort of many behaviors are sort of Gaussian, and we look at the middle of the distribution, and if the tails are a little off, who cares, right? But actually, an awful lot of stuff is for many behaviors. The median behavior is in the tail of the distribution of people. So, like, if we are if we're thinking about something like giving money in politics, right? It is a mass behavior. A lot of people give money in politics, but the vast majority of people do not contribute. And then if we're looking at the median dollar in politics, the median dollar in politics literally comes from billionaires, literally comes from a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of people. And that's important. That studying money in politics is important. Or if we're studying political expression on Twitter, that comes from a tiny fraction of people. I also think that these emerging measures, in part because they're drawing from very large samples, allow you to, first of all, they make visible subpopulations that are often neglected by the powers that be. And I think Du Bois's work on looking at the economic predicament of African Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s leaned heavily on administrative tax data, and it made visible the invisible, and it made visible a powerless subpopulation. And this in some ways sort of represents the power of what we can do with these emerging data sources. But and also just on the median and majorities, just another example from my own research is if you look at, this is looking at exposure and sharing of fake news on Twitter in 2016, and what we see in the left is exposure, and actually I'll put quotes around that. I'm going to discuss exposure and attention in a few minutes. Is that we see that roughly 1% of the people we're looking for accounted for 80% of exposure to fake news on Twitter, and that roughly 0.1% in our sample accounted for fake news shares, and 1% accounted for all fake news sharing. Well, if a standard social science method dealing with a few thousand people just would not be viable at capturing such rare behaviors, but we might think those rare behaviors are actually pretty important. Big question is, what is accessible to measurement? And this is a picture of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was a long, interesting story about who could get access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the science and the research around this completely changed when access was dramatically broadened because of digital access, not necessarily at the intention of the people who controlled the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think this captures, it took many decades before the Dead Sea Scrolls were available for broader research. And so, a lot of things are recorded, not all things. Most of that is not actually visible for research, and a lot of things are recordable. So if we're doing platform-based stuff, there's the question of what is accessible, and here are some of the major platforms. What do these platforms allow to be visible through APIs? What is acquirable not through APIs, and what are the implications of that, which I'll discuss in a few minutes? And what are the big things that we are missing as a scientific community? And what is visible is obviously what the powerful platforms will allow, and that does beg the question, what aren't we seeing? I think one answer I've given, this is a commentary in PNAS looking at studying human attention on the internet. One of the big things that we are all missing there are exceptions, but generally is studying human attention, seeing what people saw on Twitter, for example. There are a ton of papers from Twitter data based on what people are sharing, what people are retweeting, what people reply to. But that's all activity data in terms of expression of various kinds. But what we're not seeing is what people saw. Now, Twitter knows what people saw, right? They can see what people saw in their news feeds. Like that's, I'm sure, in Twitter systems somewhere. But researchers don't, and there's almost no research on what people saw on Twitter. And that's just emblematic of the broader field. There are a few exceptions, so I'm not saying there's zero research in this, but really it's a microscopic fraction of the whole. And that's a big gap in our collective research agenda, because arguably a large chunk of what we care about is what people are attending to on the internet for those studying the internet. Final big thing I want to discuss is the ethics of measurement. The regulatory regime around research is largely based on the 1979 Belmont Report, which focused substantially on biomedical research, which I think was a good place to start when it comes to ethics, because the harms there are literally life and death. It's not ideal, actually, for much of social science, and it's definitely poorly aligned with computational social science. I think that that the notions of harm in the Belmont Report really focused, again, substantially on physical harm and the choices people were making if they were, let's say, in a medical trial, and the risks that they were taking, and were they fully informed, and really rested heavily on the notions of individual autonomy and consent, right? Like, do you know the risks you're taking and the benefits and costs, and do you still want to do it? Is there pressure? Is there, making sure there's no pressure put on people? But it really, it's a big leap from that to thinking about the kinds of informational spillovers that can come from large-scale data collection. Inferential models, we can infer things about you from what you've done. We can infer things about your friends, and so on. And all of this, I'd say, is raises a different set of questions around how do we guard privacy? How do we keep the data secure? Where are the challenges of, let's say, a tool like differential privacy for measuring? Differential privacy is a way to add noise to the data so you can't identify people, but also reduces to some extent the value of the data. How do we make sure that we look at the digitally underrepresented? And then on the positive side, what is the duty to record and measure? And I think on the bottom right, for example, satellite pictures from prison camps in I think it was North Korea, and so like this is really a powerful thing to think about. What can we see, and how can we hold the powerful accountable? And so I think our current regulatory regime is just very, very poorly matching the needs of the field for self-regulation. I also worry that, I would assert that ethics in research in particular needs to be a shield generally for the weak, that is, those who are subjects of research, but it has the potential in this to be a sword for the powerful. And I think an example here was the effort by Facebook to shut down data collection from the NYU Ad Observatory, and part of what they cited here was the need for privacy. And on the one hand, there was a bit of a potential issue there, but I think arguably was dealt well with by the NYU Ad Observatory. And so the question is, how do we make sure, on the one hand, to deal with these ethical and privacy issues, but then not to say, all right, any independent research on the platforms is shut down. It's really the thing to worry about generally when we think about privacy and data and so on, is that conjunction of insight and data with power. And the question with researchers generally don't have the power, but there is sort of this need to figure out, how do we keep data secure, how do we guarantee privacy, and so on. And I think we collectively have a ways to go in doing these things well. The bigger picture here, of course, is thinking about the ethics and power and research in this field. The market cap of Apple, Microsoft, Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon is above $9 trillion, at least last I looked, which was a week or two ago. The endowment value of the 130 richest universities is $700 billion. Literally, on a daily basis, the value of these companies fluctuates by a Harvard or two, right? I mean, it's just these numbers are mind-boggling, and it is a concentration of economic power that really, is extraordinary. And there is a key challenge for researchers of how to maintain independence from these platforms, but also constructive engagement. That I think there's a need for trying to explore models of constructive engagement, but also to not be seduced by that power and money. And I'd say academia hasn't always had a great history when we look at big pharma, or we look at nutrition, or we look at tobacco. So like this is a big thing that we need to wrestle with. And then the final thing I wanted to mention and discuss is an effort that's centered at Northeastern to create an observatory for online human and platform behavior. And we're going to come up with a pithier name for this. But this is a very sizable project that we just started in October. And it will involve desktop and mobile-based data collection. And we're going to start collecting data this summer in a smaller scale way, and then scale up by an order of magnitude every year, hopefully getting on the order of 50 to 100,000 ongoing subjects by the end. And it will collect data on what people are doing online, but also capture some intra-platform behavior. So it's going to capture both some of what you see within the platform, but also some of what the platform is choosing for you to see. And then the idea is to, in a secure and privacy-preserving way, provide analytic access to researchers, under, like I said, data never leaving our system, queries going in, subject to certain kinds of oversight, data use agreements, legal agreements, et cetera. But in any case, the idea there is to create a collective good for researchers, so that there will be this research-oriented, internet-based infrastructure that will be a common good. So I'd ask you to keep an eye on this space. So with that, I'm going to pause or stop screen sharing.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Lazer, for that really, really excellent and thought-provoking keynote. There were so many things that I think you mentioned that hopefully we'll be able to not necessarily address, but think through over the next year or so as we develop and conduct more digital data research. At this point in time, I'm going to open up the Q&A. I noticed there was already one question, so we'll start with that. And this is something that is also near and dear to my heart, particularly as I do a lot of cross-platform research. And so Kai-Ping Chen asks or notes that she highly agrees with you that we need more research on cross-platform work. And she was wondering whether you could elaborate on what kind of measurement issues we need to think about and be careful about when we measure heterogeneity across platforms and when we consider algorithmic confounding issues.
Yeah, I think there are a number of interesting things there. I think that one issue is to think about how what are similar things. I mean, think about things that sort of look similar but are different, and to make sure that our measurement approaches that we get at, we reflect carefully on something like a tie on Twitter versus a tie on Facebook, and how are those different things, and how do we want to get at that. If we on the algorithmic confounding, I think one of the things so I think one of the things is that and one of the challenges of studying the internet right now is many of the things that are sort of theoretically similar are scattered across platforms. And so like this is enormously frustrating in a way, because we're using Zoom right now, but I did a bunch of meetings on Teams yesterday, and well, I used to use Skype a lot, although that has like completely disappeared. And of course, there are many other ways to talk to people. Like if we're thinking about like even a question, like I'll give you an example, because this was in a survey where we're trying to get at some of this. We're like, all right, we want to get at something called talking to someone, right? But it turns out, like even with a survey question, getting at talking is hard, because first of all, some people use the word talking colloquially to not just be like voice mediated synchronous communication. And so like it could be like doing something text-based on the phone. For some people say, oh yeah, I was talking to them. It's like, no, you weren't. That's not talking. Talking requires voice, right? And so then you need to get at, well, then we want to make sure, but we can't just name the platform because platforms typically have multiple functionalities. So, but there is something special to voice mediated communication. And so like, well, do we have to say, have a question that says, did you talk to someone that is using your voice? Right, or something ridiculous like that. But like thinking what are like functionally equivalent behaviors that cross platforms. And the problem, of course, is also ironically that many of these things now are going to be almost impossible to recapture in digital trace data, because like they're scattered in these different silos. And so one of the fundamental things is that there may be equivalent things that just are missing, fundamentally missing in your data. And how do we deal with that? And then how do we maybe go back to maybe surveys sometimes to say, who do you talk to via some way where you hear their voices and they hear your voices? It could be like I even talk to people. I'm old school. Well, you can't quite see this. It's fading here. This is like a landline, right? I know I'm old, right? This is proof how old I am. But like did you use a landline, a cell phone, or whatever? We don't care. But like that may be the kind of thing you can only get at with sometimes, ironically, with surveys, in addition to contextualize the digital trace data. The other thing I want to note in terms of algorithmic confounding is the cross-platform algorithmic confounding. So one of the things that, this is a paper I have with Ron Robertson, but we're looking at what Google recommends to people. And one of the interesting things about Google is they would recommend for people, if you search on them, sometimes tweets of theirs. And so there's a way in which Google, which is a much bigger platform than Twitter, what might have been creating these weird patterns on Twitter that are completely exogenous to the platform. Or maybe they're endogenous because Google knows a lot of what's happening on Twitter, but we have no idea. But like there is a sort of this way that the inter-platform interaction then manifests just within the platform. And you're like, what the hell is going on in Twitter? It's like, oh no, that's Google. You're just looking at Twitter data, but actually that's driven by Google. And that's again a problem with cross-platform algorithmic confounding.
Totally. And there's just so many cross-platform dynamics that we don't
Yes.
consider. One of the things that I always, if folks are looking for research papers, more research on screenshots, I think is really necessary in terms of like cross-platform information and discourse dynamics. We have another really excellent question here, in keeping in line with thinking about what kind of research we need more of. Eunice asks, apart from cross-platform research, I think there needs to be a look at cross-country contexts and cultures. Yes. And so, Dr. Lazer, what would be your suggestion in this regard?
Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, because obviously all of these practices, online practices, are culturally and politically embedded. And so, what's even polite to say, of course, is going to then manifest on Facebook in the US versus another country. And so, I think in the ideal world, and this poses challenges because, in the ideal world, you collect platform data by country. And so like you have, Twitter data from multiple countries and so on, or Facebook data from multiple countries, or search data from multiple countries. The challenge there is that then requires competence, multi-country competence on the research team, which is, I think, one of the things, if there are any funders out there, fund research like this, right? Because I do think that what we want to do is to build things where where we try to do our best to align some measurement schemes while dealing with the cultural differences, so that we're like saying, all right, we're going to have like certain behavioral things where it's sort of, the metrics are comparable, but then we're trying to then culturally embed the difference in behaviors based on what we see in France in politics versus the US or wherever. Part of what I would like to do with this observatory that I was just mentioning is that I'm looking for partners in other countries that would adapt like a lot of the engineering. We're spending a lot on engineering, but like the marginal cost on the engineering side of taking that somewhere else are pretty close to zero, but then there are costs in terms of data collection. But the idea would be to set up a series of national observatories where you could sort of like have some standardization of the behavioral data being collected, but some adaptation to indigenous circumstances in terms of cultural norms and politics, and then some degree of like, alignment also of survey instrumentation to the extent that makes sense, so that you can do comparative work across countries. So like literally build this infrastructure that it's made up of a bunch of national based nodes made up of teams that have cultural national competencies, but also then are speaking to the broader global system. So that would be like my broader ambition, although like, right now I'll be pleased to start collecting data from the US in August. But like part of the point is that's so right. That question is so on the money. And I think there's so much scientific value to be done on sort of cross-national and cross-cultural data collection.
An infrastructure like that would be, absolutely phenomenal, right? It would really, I think, advance a lot of the current scholarship being done. We're coming up on time, but I'm going to just do one last question. Yun Kang asks, much of the algorithmic changes on platforms are unknown to outsiders of the company, right? And this is something that you've repeatedly mentioned in your keynote. And of course, there are things like Facebook papers and circumstances where this information is leaked or comes to light. And so what should academics do in trying to address it, consider it? How should academics consider this?
Boy, it's a problem. It's just a headache, right? Like it's sort of like here. So here I have my measuring stick. It's a foot long. I pull on it and it doesn't actually stretch and so on. And it's pretty reliably, probably at a molecular level, it sort of fluctuates a little bit in length, but it's pretty darn stable. But like the challenge we have in our fields is that it's sort of like, this is a foot long, but like maybe it's not, maybe it's 2 feet, or maybe it's 6 inches long. And so like one of the things that we need to do is that we have to sort of assume a degree of ignorance in terms of what platforms are doing. There's signal, but there's like some weird heterogeneity there. And I think that the thing we need to do is to adapt our world to thinking about our measures as being different from, as sort of being rubbery and like needing to constantly reevaluate, critically reevaluate, and so on. And then again, this points to the need for a professional infrastructure of like of evaluating standards of what measures are, and we don't have that. Like a lot of our stuff is one-off, and so we are in some ways lacking the core things we need to do good science in a place where it's like gravity changes somewhat every day, and sort of like, well, you need to recalibrate everything. You didn't really lose weight; you actually gained weight today. Darn. So we need, again, this rests on like having to constantly reevaluate our measures, reevaluate the relationships in the world in terms of, do they work the way they work, and then also use that to shed light on the algorithmic changes of the platforms, because like what the platforms are doing are societally consequential, and so those changes are things that we should be keeping an eye on. That in itself is a hugely important area of research. And so part of this is we need to do it just to understand humanity, but part of it is that we have to understand what the platforms are doing to humanity. So I do think that we collectively need to build this sort of the standards for our field, and some kind of collective standards infrastructure, and to constantly critically reevaluate the standards of our measures.
Wow, thank you. That is, I think, great for us to end on. Thank you again, Dr. Lazer, for this really thought-provoking keynote, and thanks to all the folks who have asked questions.